be more than 3 or 5 or something.
We met a potential housemate. It didn't seem like it was.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Forum. My name is Ashton, and this is Natalie. And today we have Sabrina Monarch presenting Mythologies of Depression.
And I thought we would start with a moment of silence because one of our peers, Matthew Flowers, just recently passed away. And I know some people, I don't know if anybody's tuning in, but some people just came from a vigil that happened earlier today. So just a moment to pause and reflect on him. He was a really happy person. So I think just feeling that energy. When he talked, he would light up, like he was just really inclusive. And just his name, Matthew Flowers, like his name, just imagining that, I think sending that image of like a field of flowers or something really bright that we can all reflect on for a couple moments. However you want to. Thank you. So today we have Sabrina, who is an evolutionary astrologer. She's also my housemate and a close friend of mine. And she's introduced a lot of people in the community to evolutionary astrology. So a lot of people always cite Sabrina's work and monarch astrology as something that's really opened up a new experience or realm of consciousness for them. And today she's talking about mythologies of depression. So just bringing in the archetypes, and it's kind of fitting. I feel like today's been, or this week has felt for a lot of people to be kind of a rough week. I don't know, I'm just speaking for myself, but I think, yeah. So this should, I feel like this will be really helpful in just tapping into a different way of framing those energies or the energies of depression. And Sabrina also just published her podcast, Magic of the Spheres, if you all want to subscribe or tune into that. So welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Mythologies of Depression is about the different kind of models that we use to talk about depression. So are we talking about a condition in the brain or something that exists in the cosmos as part of creation? And how would we interact with it? I'm going to be sharing some of my personal experience with healing chronic depression. And it was not through the medical model, but rather through astrology. Welcome. Right. Wow. So good to see you. We're just starting. Literally just starting. Gosh, it's all warm up here because of the projection.
Yeah.
So something that I want to open with is an experience that I had when I was 8 years old, or actually 8 and 9. I was super in love with butterflies, and I don't remember how this obsession and how this love with them started, but I remember waking up in it, and everything I owned was butterfly themed, and my grandpa taught me how to catch butterflies with my 2 fingers and to set them free. So I would spend every day outside catching butterflies. There was this bush outside my house that attracted a bunch of brown butterflies. And if you asked me what I wanted to do when I grow up, I would say a lepidopterist, and monarch butterflies are my favorite. One day I was outside catching butterflies like I did every day, day in and day out for months, and the whole monarch migration came flying down my street while I was outside playing. And this was particularly remarkable in the sense that the monarch butterflies are around 60 miles away from their nearest migration route location. And they had to navigate through the maze of the suburbs to get to my street and to get to my house that day. I just thought it was great. I didn't really make a story out of it. It was just the coolest thing that had ever happened. And a few months later, I got kind of insecure that like other people weren't really obsessed with things in the way that I was about butterflies. So I decided, I didn't like that people were knew that I was like the butterfly girl. So I just kind of put it aside and was done with butterflies at age 9. And then I had a rough time in middle school and in high school. I was depressed. I wasn't happy. I didn't feel a sense of belonging and community. And so my mom told me, she's like, chemical depression is a condition in our family. Like there's just an imbalance in your brain and you can take medication for it. So I thought I would try it out. And when I was walking to the psychiatrist's office, I noticed this butterfly on the road. So I went to go look up to it closer, and I noticed that it was dying. It was twitching and it had holes in its wings. And my symbolic consciousness wasn't super activated at that age, but I was struck by the image, and I was also struck by my lack of ability to touch it. I wanted to take it and put it under a bush somewhere, but I was kind of afraid of it. And then I went into the psychiatrist's office and got my prescription, and I was on and off antidepressants from the age of 15 to 21. But then some really drastic events happened in my life at age 21 that forever changed my opinion on psychiatry, kind of lifted the veil of the medical model completely. It's not that I ever necessarily bought into it, but it just was all that I was considering. So I'm going to read some text. It's from a novel that I wrote about this whole experience. And though some names are changed, this is like an autobiographical part. And some details of the story are changed in the whole book, but not really in these paragraphs. So this is just an experience. On the morning of May 1st, 2012, I dreamt of Jupiter. I was sitting cross-legged in the clouds and playing with the cloud shapes by moving my hand. Time didn't exist, though the environment around me pulsed and breathed like jellyfishes underwater. There were voices and something important being discussed, but it all seemed so safe at the same time, giving me the feeling of being a child held by the voices of elders. From the tone of their voices, I only knew that I was about to be bestowed an advancement in life. Yet the voices must discuss it first, and they knew they could talk about it around me without me really understanding what they were saying. When I awoke, it was after walking through a curtain of clouds I had spread open. There was not a moment of transition. I simply woke up the sight of my bedroom window with one word on my tongue, Jupiter. My bedroom window displayed only the tall sky, and nothing obstructed the view. The room is simple and open, a large rectangle with high ceilings. I didn't own very many things besides my clothes and some stacks of books underneath the window. There was a private bathroom and plush carpet that was deep enough to feel between the toes. My bed was on the floor, no higher than 3 inches tall, and covered in a thick layer of deep black velvet. Some research I had gathered about Jupiter transiting square at a 90-degree angle to my natal Mars led me to believe that although I would be filled with extra energy, I would have to take precaution not to overestimate my abilities and take on more than I could handle. You have the capacity to make a disastrous error in judgment, some text on my computer had obliquely warned. I certainly did feel an abundance of energy. I had read another interpretation that impressed itself on me. The tendency upon hearing that a great opportunity awaits you is to sit back and do nothing, expecting the opportunity to come to you. Don't do this. Do not wait. Go out and do things, have adventures, and increase the avenues through which Jupiter may find you. This is not a time to be wasted. Jupiter transits, even hard ones, are manna and nectar of the gods. And so this next part is just a little bit later in the day. A steady reserve of excitement I had cultivated all day, beginning with the dream of Jupiter, seemed to be stunted. I was aware of being very upset and uncomfortable for no proportionate reason, and my bedroom was beginning to feel like a box. I thought to my medicine cabinet, the silver light of the exterior mirror sharp in my periphery. There was a bottle of yellow pills. I couldn't remember if I had taken one that morning, but I also didn't want to double the dose by taking another. I went to go look at them to see if I could jog my memory. The sight of the chalky yellow pills startled me as they hugged the bottom of the bottle. The thing to watch out for, they say, is believing you don't need the pills after you become happy. Many patients do this and then become unhappy again. Save yourself the trouble and just take the medication. The yellow pills looked foreign and strange to me, nearly repulsive. I had begun to see my recent depressions as a myth, just moments of confusion and misplaced desire. I could agree that the pills had maybe kick-started my process, but now they just looked terribly alien. I couldn't swallow one anymore without wondering what was inside of it. I decided to pack a bowl instead, and I smoked and entered another realm. From this tower, I could observe my not too far off past self, pacing the room and contemplating the merits of psychiatry. Here, my anxiety did not settle, but I was brought to an overwhelming intuition that I must look up moon opposition. This time when I made a search, I found an article about moon opposition Pluto I hadn't seen before. This one said the usual things, intense, psychic, etc. But then it said, a moon Pluto person is able to skillfully extract information from others, like a spy. Such a person should take care to not always play the spy, but to engage earnestly with others. My computer became excessively bright to look at. I turned it off and shut down the screen and felt as though I would burst if I stayed indoors any longer. And so I did go out to the woods, and I had a magical experience, and I looked up at the trees and the birds and the sky, and I wished out loud for magic. And I don't quite know why I said that. It just was what came out. And so the night goes on, and there's a series of events that leads me into just to be in the right place at the right time. When I arrived at the bar, there were no seats left at Beatrice's table. The table next to them was in a corner of the bar, where a bearded man wearing yellow sun goggles sat by himself with a pile of books. After we said hello to everyone, Beatrice's boyfriend gestured Sean and me over to the other table, saying he'd ask the man sitting there if he'd mind sharing. I sat down next to the bearded man, and Sean sat in the seat across from us. I turned myself to the group. A girl I hadn't met before was on my right. After a little bit of small talk, she whispered to me, "The man over there talks in different accents. I've seen him here before." "What do you think that means?" I asked her. "I don't know, it's just weird." I thought for a moment and then turned to him. "Hi, what's your name?" "Finn," he replied. Definitely an accent, but I wasn't sure what kind yet. "I'm Katarina," I said. "Pleasure." He was muscular and had dark blonde hair, and his beard was thick. He looked self-contained with an air of earthy exhaustion, like he'd been working outdoors all day. Besides the books, he also had a collection of trinkets splayed over the table and a backpack beside him leaning against the window. There was nothing about him that suggested he was looking to socialize. "I like your glasses," I said, eager to get him talking. "Oh, well, thank you. These change everything." Last slide, text. "Like color therapy," I said. "I know someone who sells colored glasses for that reason. Though I'm curious about your accent. Where are you from?" "Oh, I've been all over the world. It seems I move somewhere new every couple of years. I'm leaving here soon too, just doing some work for my brother, then leaving at the new moon." "You travel by the moon? Where are you going?" "The next adventure," he smiled. "I do everything by the moon when I can, but sometimes the mundane world wrangles you in and you have to follow its schedule instead." He dug his hand into a jar with a top not much larger than his hand to get a piece of blackened meat. "You want some salmon?" My brother hand-smoked it. "That's okay," I said. I looked over at his books. "But you know something about astrology?" I asked, eyeing the word astrology and another title reading The Magician's Companion. He looked me in the eye and assumed a new seriousness. "I'm Jupiter," he said. My research from earlier flashed to mind. A moon Pluto person is able to skillfully extract information from others like a spy. Such a person should take care to not only play the spy, but to engage earnestly with others. Only because these words came to my mind did I say I dreamt of Jupiter this morning. And so we became fast friends, and I went way down the rabbit hole at this point. I learned pretty soon that he was an ex-CIA agent and a shaman. And he offered to teach me anything that I wanted to know, perhaps about magic or spycraft. And this was a person who believed in magic and would have full-on conversations with God, looking up to the corner of the room and channeling information and sharing it with me. He was telling me about spirits. He also had, theories about reality that I'd never heard someone share with me before, like chemical depression doesn't exist. That's one way of looking at it, but there's actually spirits on this planet, and negative spirits or evil spirits can talk and you can mistake them as your own voice. So every time that you're feeling self-doubt or self-criticism, in some sense, you're possessed. You're not just having a thought loop that's happening in your own brain. And he was teaching me about how you could eat healthier or change things about your life to become less inhabitable to these so-called spirits. Not so-called, I believe in it. But I had never heard someone talk like this. In addition to this, I was having these unbelievably magical experiences. And I was experiencing animal totems and also having astral plane experiences of hanging out with the spy on the dream plane. And I'd never been prepared for that. No one taught me that that was real, but it was the most real thing I'd ever experienced in my life. And so by night, my old life was disintegrating. I had this really disturbing experience occur where this slideshow of imagery and memories would come up from childhood about all these different ways where it seemed like reality had conspired to enact a performance out of me. There's these rewards and punishments that kind of get us to be a certain way. And I saw all these moments where I had decided to hide. You know, here's my authentic character, and I'm going to put it in a box because it's not allowed, or I'm going to get punished if I act this way. And I didn't have an intellectual framework for this. I didn't study, it wasn't a psychological thing. It was just a pure download and a pure realization. And it filled me up with this kind of chaotic rage. I also realized during this time that I had never been clinically depressed. I saw all the factors in my life that had led to being unhappy, and it had nothing to do with my brain chemistry. It was about, traumas passed through my ancestry. It was about the kinds of food that people eat and the mainstream culture that I was also eating. Things like that. And so I stopped taking my antidepressants cold turkey. And so besides having this kind of disturbing kind of slideshow imagery night by night of trauma, I felt more alive and more full of energy than I'd ever felt in my life. I felt totally on fire. I was discovering psychic ability, and I was beginning to see auras. And so not necessarily glowing lights around things, but a little bit like that. Seeing objects or seeing people or seeing entire situations reveal themselves like a fluttering of the veil. So I was no longer just seeing mundane things, but seeing through. I also suddenly had new gifts in language and in communication, and I was speaking in a fiery way and enchanting people and getting certain people to be really excited about my ideas. And I had never had such a quicksilver ability in terms of my speaking life. I was a writer, but not a speaker. And from this really ecstatic place of feeling like magic was real in my life, I decided that I needed to share this information with my family. And so this is where the disastrous error in judgment comes into play. I had these really intense dreams of pure white light and birds singing. I had this feeling that I had to speak all the time without filter and that it would set me free. So I decided that I would try to convince and convert other people to my newfound shamanic reality, including my family. I was convinced that my ideas and the new things that I was experiencing were compelling enough to convert people. Everyone wants to experience magic. No one wants to be in this conventional box. I spoke really passionately about having never been depressed, that it was circumstances, that it was ancestral trauma, etc., and that my family didn't really need pharmaceuticals either. Let's free ourselves of this, and that there's other answers. And my parents responded with great concern and that I should see a doctor. And I discovered that my mystical experience and my vast, deep errors in integrating it, I didn't have the frameworks, I didn't necessarily have the guidance for integrating it, was seen as pathological. I agreed to go see the doctor and thought that the doctor would see how full of life I was and how excited about life I was and would be like, she's so healthy, she's great, don't worry. But I was quickly diagnosed as bipolar, and I never cared about the diagnosis, never resonated with it, still don't. But in that moment, it was like this label was actually holding weight and gravity for every other person in the room. My parents, the psychiatrist, it was like a sentence. And my own reality had become super fantastical. I was seeing auras, having experiences with animal totems, and experiencing things on the astral plane, and I was suddenly psychic overnight. So my life was fantastic, but the psychiatric paradigm seemed fantastical as well. Perhaps they were possessed by these evil spirits. You know, they didn't believe that my reality was valid, or any reality that you can't see or measure with science or with empiricism is valid. But they do believe that your brain chemistry affects you and makes you ill, and that in my case, I would just be subject to flip out randomly throughout my life if I didn't take medication forever. So I spent a few weeks trying to argue my case to my parents and to the psychiatrist, but it was systematically denied as invalid. And I'd get angry that I was not being listened to, but then my anger was also a symbol of, you know, oh, there's something wrong with you, you're emotionally imbalanced. And so eventually I realized it would just be smarter to pretend I was with the program. And so it took me 6 months, but I faked my way out through psychiatric attention. But I was in this very open psychic state. And the way that I experienced these medications were that they were not friends, they were not allies. I had really awful side effects. And like, I mean, gruesome really, just like intense suicidal ideation, but also I couldn't sleep, I had insomnia, I was so tired, but I did soon discover that if I imagined these really violent ways of killing people, that my whole body would relax and I would fall asleep. And so they do say that there's homicidal and suicidal thoughts as a side effect of these medications, and I directly experienced that. So when I got out of this situation, by the way, the reason that I didn't just not take the medications was because I didn't want to get caught not taking them. And you can't just take them in front of people if I was asked to and then throw them back up because they disperse into your system immediately. And you have to titrate up the dosage. And if you just take the full dose all at once, you can get very sick. So I didn't really see a way out besides through and just pretending that I was with the treatment.
Sabrina, you said this was when you were like 21 years old?
Yeah. I learned that there were some core assumptions in the so-called, mythology of the medical model. And this is that brain chemistry imbalances cause mental illness, and then mental illness is a reason to take medications. It's this kind of straight shot, this is what you do. Consciousness and emotions are located in the brain, and chemical imbalances in the brain are the source of mental illness, and by directly manipulating this source, just change the way the objects are moving in your brain, mental illness can be alleviated. The assumptions about what constitutes mental illness are also entangled with social values, institutions, and power structures. So seeing things that other people can't see in a shamanic culture, that would be okay, but in our culture, not so much. Not liking my psychiatrist, thinking that he's not really my friend or not really helping me, there's some kind of power thing there. I'm not being compliant. And then the medications, there's this assumptions that this is the most valid way to treat mental distress and that these medications should be taken daily after the point of diagnosis to avoid any kind of relapse. Just take it forever. But I'd had this intuition during my awakening experience that brain chemistry was not what I had been told my whole life, that it was in a circular feedback loop relationship with a bunch of other factors, and that brain chemistry may appear, but it's a response to something. So you can generate other things in your life to generate new chemical responses. If you introduce different dietary shifts or movement practices or intentionally cultivate values in your life, you can change your brain chemistry. Brain chemistry could be a potential reflection, but not a causal agent of one's emotional reality. And if there's this, mass phenomenon of all these individuals being depressed on the planet, why are we medicating all of them individually instead of creating social change? And these were things I was thinking about and talking about, and it's like blasphemous, like take the pills. So, once I got back to my college town and was titrated off the medications, secretly, I did myself. I wanted to be really happy again. I had felt, besides the more disturbing aspects of my awakening experience, I was so happy, I was so alive. So I wanted to integrate that back into my life. And I like this quote by Martin Shaw for that reason. It says, after the experience of any kind of soulful awakening comes the task of developing a daily, unglamorous, defined practice, travel back and forth to the kind of perception you want to inhabit. The difficulty was harnessing the energy, to be like Dionysus, riding the leopard without being torn to pieces. For that first experience of wildness to be sustained, to mature, it has to have other elements in the potion nourishing it. So I had a challenge set out before me when I first was free from this situation. How can I live into this new kind of life of fulfillment that I'd imagined and previewed during my awakening experience? Embed that into my daily life. And to get as high as I wanted without being accused by outside sources of being manic. And astrology really helped me answer that question. This is the wheel of the zodiac. So just for reference, this is the 12 zodiac signs, the planetary rulers on the outside, and a few clarifying phrases. It's a busy image. I use it for teaching normally. But I learned this system, all the 12 signs encompass an area of life, and together this is a map of totality. There's no experience that is not represented in this map, if not in one archetype, a combination of archetypes, kind of like a color wheel, and how all the colors come from the primary colors. I found that Cancer and Capricorn held insights that could help me condition and structure my emotional reality so that I could be happier more often. I didn't have to be manic, depressive, and I didn't have to be chronically depressed either. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Cancer and Capricorn and how we can combine them for emotional well-being. So Cancer is ruled by the crab, ruled by the moon. It's represented by the crab, not ruled by it, sorry. It relates to the home and the feeling of security and feeling cared for. Emotional expression. It's also the ego, and not the ego in the sense of like, oh, ego, like this bad thing, but just your personality structures, your imprinting, the membrane of your consciousness. Cancer opens when safe. It loves comfort and nourishment. It's about vulnerability and immaturity. It's a private inner self. From studying this archetype, I wondered, why are the ego and the home housed in the same archetype? What do they have in common? The ego is kind of like a house for the soul, in a sense. The way that our ego is conditioned has a certain experience, just as the way that your house is designed or organized creates a certain experience. So Capricorn is the opposite archetype. And the way that these polarities work with the zodiac is that they're two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other, and somehow they have to be balanced or integrated. And an imbalance in one will create an imbalance in the other. So Capricorn, just to preview a little bit, is all about control. So of course, when I was so emotive and wanted to speak all the time without filter, it manifested in my environment or in the other, the kind of constricting, oppressive forces of unwanted psychiatric intervention. And I could recognize that and heal from that, and that, I'm not a victim of this, or this didn't happen to me, but internally I wasn't boundaried, so the environment created boundaries for me. Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. It relates to society. Before I get into these, I want to say its mascot is the goat, or the mountain goat, so there's something about climbing with it. I like to use this image when talking about Capricorn and Saturn because it shows two different sides of the same archetype. You have the man-made or the industrial version, and then you have the more embedded, nature-based, natural version of Saturn, Capricorn. And it seems like sometimes when people first learn about Capricorn or Saturn, they only can see the skyscrapers up here in that archetype. But this is related to society, social and cultural norms and traditions, Like Cancer, it's also feelings of safety and security, but it's through things like competence and things being under control. Authority and responsibility, boundary and structure, maturity, public self, the superego. The force of conditioning in our lives, hard time, and cause and effect. And these effects will take time for them to appear. It's accumulated circumstances which create a consequence later in time. Cancer, on the other hand, is a moment-to-moment sign in a sense. It's how we feel, and that fluctuates throughout the day. For me, working with the Cancer-Capricorn connection led into a pathway of constructing the emotional body. So there's a few different connections between these archetypes I want to highlight. The structure of our lives, Capricorn, will condition our emotional well-being and even our identities and our ego. Cancer. Repeated emotional states accumulated over time create patterns which we may stick to because of their relative security, not necessarily because they work or that they feel good. You can be in a stuffy house and forget what it's like to open the window. A way to increase happiness or to alleviate chronic depression could be to become more mature and responsible, Capricorn, about how we create nourishment in our lives. And some of the things we do for self-care, we think we're taking care of ourselves, do not actually create the desired consequences, is Capricorn. Clarissa Pinkola Essays has something on this that I think represents the Cancer-Capricorn connection, where she's talking about there's a difference between comfort and nurture. If you have a plant that is sick because you keep it in a closet and you say soothing words to it, that will be comfort. If you take it out of the closet and put it in the sun, give it something to drink, and then talk to it, that's nurture. So what could we do for depression that is actually helping ourselves, helping the plant that we are, versus keeping ourselves in a dark closet and saying soothing words to ourselves by pacifying ourselves in some way? We can synthesize the Cancer and Capricorn archetypes for emotional well-being. We can discover what we need to feel good and cared for, which is the Cancer side of things. And then with Capricorn's standard and structure and boundary and discipline, commit to those things and embed them into the quality of our everyday lives. Make it a standard. This is also about learning how to parent oneself and to make beneficial decisions for oneself, regardless of whether or not we feel like it. Depressed people don't feel like doing a lot. And using that kind of Capricorn ability to go without or do the right thing without feeling it can be useful in that. Of course, too much of that, always doing things, even if we don't feel like it, is a source of depression as well. So there's that balance of staying emotionally attuned and emotionally sensitive while also being responsible and getting things done. Learning emotional control to curb addictive sources of comfort, and creating actual permission and time, Capricorn, taking accountability to invest in the needs of the soft and vulnerable aspects of the self. And these are just a few more ideas on the same. Making a disciplined habit of self-compassion and kindness while we are growing instead of practicing self-reprimand. The kind of Saturn can be internalized in a sense of really harsh self-judgment. We're not up to standard, and like this kind of forceful pushing the self back down. We have to also learn how to listen to parts of ourselves that are crying out, Cancer, that we otherwise repress, and so that we can make more supportive decisions for ourselves. We're not ignoring that inner child. There's a Saturn and a Capricorn problem when it comes to thinking about depression, because we look to this archetype as Saturn and Capricorn are about depression inherently, as though that's its character. But at a deeper root of Capricorn and Saturn, so this boundary structure-oriented sign, it's not depression. Depression is a symptom. At a deeper root, I'd suggest that these archetypes is conditioning process, cause and effect, and that the things that we do create realities, and then these realities create responses, and these responses create things that confirm the original reality. This happens in our ego structures and karma even over multiple lives. If we want to get into a reincarnational perspective. But to alleviate chronic depression, instead of going with the brain chemistry model, what if we consciously harnessed the conditioning process and created new feeling states and created them over time? Saturn has a really bad rap in a lot of ways. It's often perceived as this kind of cruel father figure. And this image that we have of Saturn is really a consequence of patriarchal conditioning. I wouldn't say it's inherent to the archetype. Saturn is so formulaic. It's one of the most predictable archetypes. It relates to our ability to strategize and even to engineer our reality, which of course also relates to being controlling. Nonetheless, Saturn and Capricorn aren't these archetypes that we look to for personal happiness. Not like we're gonna team up with Saturn to be happy. At the same time, they're both builders and they build structures which create the house and the ego that we live in. So what if we created structures that supported happiness? Along with the Saturn and Capricorn archetype is this feeling that things just are the way they are. There's a deep cynicism potential in these archetypes. And the whole point of Saturn is also to gain agency and to have maturity and to take accountability for the structures that we could be creating in our lives. So if we're just going back and forth between Cancer and Capricorn, things can get kind of, it's just chill, it's just a little bit mundane. What if we wired into the structures and into the habits some peak experience? More kind of Uranus or Aquarius energy for those of you who speak astrology. At the same time that I was studying astrology and using this Cancer-Capricorn connection to reimagine that I could create the structures of my brain and the structures of my mind and the structures of my life, and that the positive consequences of doing so would create circumstances which I would respond to with more happiness, and then my happiness would inspire more positive choices, that there are these feedback loops I could invoke. Why not also just get high for the sake of being high? And I don't mean necessarily by using substances, but by generating positive body chemistry and peak experience. I was studying law of attraction and various kinds of new age thinking, which I think can not be taken seriously or can be kind of laughed at, or it has definite problematic qualities when people are trying to integrate it in terms of ignoring reality or spiritual bypassing. At the same time, it's an amazing freedom technique to be able to tune into a visualization that makes you feel good. And you use this visualization to feel good, so it's your own natural antidepressant. What if you did that habitually every day? And these things in our reality that we respond to, events, people, circumstances, we feel as though we have to have a certain response to them, but we can invent responses we would like to have, choose our feelings. And so this was one way to get outside of being limited and bound by my existing structures and to imagine things and use these visualizations to lift myself up. This kind of goes against some of the things embedded in our language, because we have a structure where we say that things make us feel a certain way. And this goes along with kind of the Cartesian, there's physical objects moving in space, bouncing off each other and creating reactions. And we're just kind of in this chaos and there's nothing we can do about it. And other philosophies or other ways of even looking at reality scientifically are beginning to show that there's much more of a participatory element to reality, that we can respond to things by feeling a certain way, or we participate with things by feeling a certain way. And the more that we invoke that with intention and agency, we could potentially also create our own brain chemistry. I'm also aware too that having early life traumas or just trauma in general can kind of hijack brain chemistry or body chemistry, but even those things can be worked on. It's not always a dead end. I see depression more and more as a negative feedback loop and a spiral that goes downward. It turns into negative thoughts and negative self-esteem, and that creates less inspired life choices, and that creates more depression, and so the spiral goes. Some of these things that I've talked about may seem fairly just pragmatic or obvious in terms of personal happiness and having like a generally leveled or positive mood, but I'd literally never thought about these things before. The story was just that it's a thing in your brain and you have to take medications for it, and that's all you can really do. On the other hand, imagining these zodiac archetypes as naturally having a relationship, these constellations and their myths naturally being 180 degrees apart, and how you could play with the whole map of the zodiac, all of the signs included, though I didn't have time to talk about all of them, could lead into reimagining a way to participate with reality instead of just being affected by it. I think that the wisdom of Cancer and Capricorn here, with a little bit of Uranus or Aquarius and bringing in peak experience, is to interrupt these negative and depressive feedback loops. So I won't read all these through, but these are just some examples of things to do to uproot these feedback loops and create new ones. This is a kind of image that I think is part of why people don't take law of attraction or things like this seriously. It can seem a little bit lofty and a little bit out there, but the virtue of it can still apply. And this one, never mind what is, imagine it the way you want it to be so that your vibration is a match to your desire. I think of this as emotional leverage, emotion being Cancer, leverage being Capricorn, the part of us that always wants to climb. If our circumstances itself don't inspire happiness, why not imagine other ones? Engage in fantasy and visualization. That still creates brain chemistry, still creates an embodied somatic response from fantasy. So why not use that as leverage until your life actually begins to manifest things that you have positive responses to? And even then, you can't get attached to those things because they come and go. But if you always have access to feeling things on purpose and not feeling like reality itself is what binds you, or the past is what binds you to feel a certain way, you can climb emotionally. And in my case, this is how I rerouted patterns of chronic depression in my own life. Just to come back to the monarchs, this image has been important to me for years, and there's different ways that I think about it in different contexts. But for today, I think of these monarch butterflies as an image of Saturn, an image of the harvest. We don't think of Saturn necessarily as a happy or a bright or a sweet archetype. But I spent hours every day obsessed with butterflies in my face, looking at them, setting them free, finding another one and hanging out with it. And I wasn't being strategic, I just enjoyed it. Brian Swim, one of our faculty here, talks about how the horse and the bison came from the same ancestor, and at one point they diverged. And he suggests that the horse became the horse, because it loved to gallop. And in an evolutionary sense, what is it? What's your gallop? What do you love to do that it's turning you into a new being of yourself? I'd suggest that if we routinely do that thing that brings us alive, even if it's not real, even if we have to get there through the portal of fantasy or visualization, over time we'll create a harvest of some kind where our emotional reality, where once the baseline was chronic depression or just like chronic unease, through habituating peak states or galloping or monarch butterflies, uplifting our state to a higher level at a baseline. So moving forward, I encourage you to think about what your version of galloping is and ways to do it with Saturnian discipline and consistency, and see if that is another version of alleviating depression that's not necessarily bound to the medical model. Thank you, everyone. And if anyone has any questions, let me know. I don't know that one. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, well, dreaming. I have an astrological reflection, if that's okay. It's
Yeah.
gonna be kind of going in the nerd language. But I feel you building wedges, aspect-wise, that in the shamanism, to address the Scorpio or the Cancer Capricorn axis, there's that Scorpio piece. In the visualization, the fantasy, there's that Pisces piece. And so that opposition then sees a sextile and a trine. And that when we go to the dance or the sensuality, the Taurus comes alive, or the yoga and the mantra, the Virgo comes alive. And so if you see the mystic rectangles that you're building, they focus uniquely into the Gemini Sag axis for one of the rectangles, and then on the other side into the Leo Aquarius axis. And I heard a lot of that coming through. It actually really helped put a couple pieces together as I've been working on regarding mystic rectangles for some time. So I'll just offer that if you want to speak about that at length sometime. I'd love to.
Yeah, I love that. Definitely this process where I was working with Cancer and Capricorn, it was with like the whole kind of zodiac. And when I was sitting down to kind of put this together, I was like, this is so hard to explain in a non-astrological, even though it is astrological talk.
Yeah, I'll just commend you on like transmitting a lot of brilliant astrology there and it could be received by a crowd that's never heard those words. So it's a hard thing to do. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Just because I know you, I think it'd be helpful to hear, just because I've seen you develop your own systems, like your own practices that you use to cultivate your happiness. I don't know if you want to share any of that, like what does a day look like for you, or a hard day? What systems have you set in place to help with that?
My relationship to this has shifted a lot because when I started doing this, I didn't have structures in my life that validated my identity. So I was just kind of like fresh out of being thought of as insane and didn't have a community yet. And so building my business, or like having the reflection of like, oh, my business is real and like I'm doing things as a person in the world, like uplifts me. I have Capricorn North Node, so that was part of the path. But that becomes its own distraction because it's not, I can't just depend on the external world to like fulfill me, you know? So it comes back as well to editing my thoughts and choosing thoughts on purpose and having mantras, whether they're in English or kind of like Sanskrit mantras, but the English ones are more like choosing, you know, how I want to feel or how I perceive a situation and saying them until I believe them. And also having a gratitude practice. And so finding ways, because gratitude, like whenever I tune into it, I feel like the Monarch thing comes back where it's like the more I do something, the bigger it gets. And the inflation potential that I had with like being manic is very real for me. And now it doesn't burn me like it did that time. But if I start to get really grateful, like my life gets so much better and I'm like overwhelmed by it sometimes, where it's like too much of a harvest and there's too much stuff going on and I have to like chill out for a minute. So I think it's like hacking and kind of figuring out what's that upward flow of air and moving into it through thoughts and visualizations and choices as well. Like when I'm thinking about choices to make in life, I'll just like sit with options and see which one actually creates like chemistry and like electricity for me, and I'll do it even if it seems scary. Or, like,
I think our yoga practice too, like the way that you eat, like veganism.
Yeah.
Because those are really like daily.
Have you seen how like the generational life cycle of the monarch applies to your own? Has that come in at all? You know that thing they do where I think it's like 6 really short generations, six weeks from caterpillar to butterfly, and then there's one that's 6 months long.
Oh no, I don't. I'd love to
Yeah, check it out. I wish I could say it like authority, but yeah, they cruise from home to like far away, and I think 6 lives. They like 6 week lives, and then there's a generation that makes the trip all the way back.
Wow.
And that's like standard. least for like the local.
So it's just one generation that goes all the way back?
Yeah, I think, again, I wish I could say, but I think they like get to Colorado, some of them, in these like 6 short generations, and then one cruises all the way back. It's on the signs and
Okay. Whenever I learn new things about monarchs, I'm always like mind blown. So.
Could you speak to like what you've noticed, like, because we've heard about the past and now we're in the present, and like what would you say is your biggest kind of like, if you were to think about how you related to yourself then and being diagnosed and your relationship with your family, and then kind of how like a quick update to like how you relate to yourself around depression and with that as your past, like how do you kind of view your relationship with your family too? Because I feel like that would be a pretty traumatic thing to come out of, you know what I mean? Like you still obviously have a relationship to them even after going through that. So maybe kind of like, where is it now? How do you feel now?
Well, there were a couple of years where my parents thought I was on medications because I just lied because it was the easier thing to do. And after some time went and like the moment was right for various reasons, I told them the truth and we could kind of like process it. But I was just talking to my mom about it recently because I was like, you know, just FYI, I'm like sharing this story now a lot more. So I just want you to know. And we have a good relationship. And she was like, you know, at the time, it just seemed like if, you know, your kid is kind of having a breakdown that you take them to the doctor. Like I didn't realize I could take you to like a shaman. Like I don't believe in that stuff. So it didn't occur to me. And so it's just like, there's not really a sense of, and I felt that at the time, like I felt traumatized by like reality, you know, but I could understand that my parents were like in a construct and that it has just informed my like life purpose. And I also feel like had I not been so thoroughly kind of disenchanted or like disgusted or like repelled by my experience with psychiatry, that I don't know if I would have developed all these other ways of handling emotional distress. Like I think it forced me to be creative because I was so indignant that I had had this experience that I was like, I'll never go back to pharmaceuticals for mental health. So I know other people might have positive experiences with them too, but it just like, it was like too much of a medicine that turned it into a poison and I had to figure out something else.
I really appreciate the reflections on how Saturn can be used to create a container for fantasy, and in so many ways it feels like very paradoxical because fantasy is such a like. I see the Cancer Capricorn polarity, and I also see like a Saturn Neptune polarity because Saturn to me feels like it represents those hard lines and boundaries, and Neptune dissolves all of those boundaries. And so I'm curious also where in the element of like, it sounds like you're proposing that the element of control and creating a container for this fantasy can be really healthy. And I'm wondering where, and this is such a like Piscean question, of course, where like spirit or God or like life itself has freedom to play within that container. And maybe you want to speak like from your own experiences of that and like how that can operate within a container. Because in some ways it almost then can take into an extreme, become the authority of Saturn that is the control of playing God. And I don't know if there's like an answer. These are just, I have an incomplete thought.
I think those things, that's a really great question. I feel like that comes with the path of practicing different things that are about altering reality because you experience the resistance or the play of the universe. And I also did like a Virgo Pisces one where like I thought that the amount of work and effort and the little things I did would be matched by spirit. And also there's a way of like having your plan and doing all the things and then the ocean kind of washing it away and there being something else. But I think I started to view the harvest as not necessarily coming in the way that I imagined, and also imagining not losing any of my work.
It's interesting because I've always understood harvest as being associated with Or maybe it's just
Yeah.
where it's the same thing that Brett said of like seeing the wedges that were being dealt.
Yeah.
Many ways to pet the cosmic cat.
Yeah.
But yeah, seasonally. I heard in that cool thing that you were saying about how the ego is like a home for the soul to
Yeah.
dwell,
Mhm.
and that through this like Capricornian like rule rewriting, you're creating a different home. You're like reorganizing your home. So that's a way for like the fantasy to
Yeah.
dwell through a more kind of structured or Saturnian approach. And I think, I mean, I love the ring the rings of the tree that you show under the skyscrapers because
Mhm.
I love that like Terrence McKenna calling for an archaic revival because as you mentioned also in this presentation, there's many cultures where the Saturn authorities are promoting shamanic insight,
Mhm.
right? And then where we're going to go for the older wisdom is to the grandmothers who came out of the Moon Lodge, or a shaman who just drank the medicine. It's a very different perspective. So it's hard not to see Saturn through the glasses that we wear in this culture.
That's really well said.
I have a comment, not a question, but I thought it was cool too to think about that relationship in relation to the Sephira when you were pulling it into Aquarius, because Bina, which is the high priestess card in the tarot, which is Cancer, is associated with Saturn. So it's like the esoteric spiritual coming into form through Saturn, but Kepler rules the top, which is the Fool card, which is Aquarius. So we could even like use another graph to just show the journey from Kepler into Chakma and Bina as like the first pillar of the Sephira into the tree of life, and then you had like so much tree imagery. It was like getting so like we could get so esoteric about it. Like it's so cool. I'm like wanting to put tarot cards in it. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So it's a good like
Love that.
channel into that for sure.
We haven't even brought in human design.
Did you have something?
No, I was just like commenting on like the holographic nature of all the things that we use to like, map out our brain chemistry.
I had two questions, not really related. The first one is as someone who's not as familiar with astrology, I was wondering why you chose if you look at the circle, what was it called, the
Zodiac wheel.
the zodiac wheel. If all of the opposing signs like kind of represent different opposing forces or trends or what have you. First question is, why were you looking at depression through specifically Capricorn and Cancer? Like, why wouldn't you choose like Aries and Libra or whatever? So that was my first question. And my second was a little bit, so in regards, like you've had a pretty intense experience with like Western medicine. And I think that, so this prefaced by a little experience, I've seen or understood medicine a different way through doctors that are a little bit less like, you will take the medication and you will take it forever. And the understanding that I had was that meds can be a useful, first of all, they don't really know why they work. It's a little bit weird and they affect everybody very differently. And the second is that the point is because you're in that feedback loop, like you're talking about, it's really hard for somebody in that feedback loop to like cultivate these healthy practices and these healthy like ways of viewing the world that you're talking about. And so I was like, I wanted you to maybe go back to that list of things that you had that were possible ways of which to break out of that feedback loop that were medication. And also maybe just recognize that sometimes like that, I don't know, other people might have a different experience with that, with doctors that have a more subtle and forgiving understanding of how they work and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I feel like I had an experience with working with doctors where it's like they were colluding with my parents. So instead of the doctor actually like meeting me with my needs, there was like this disciplinary, like this is what it will be. And all the doctors I worked with were like, well, when I was on antidepressants, I had the free will to go on and off them without the doctor being like, you need to do this forever. But in the experience I had with the later psychiatrist, his belief system on it was like, you should take this forever or else you'll just be subject to kind of have another episode, and we don't want that, so take these medications forever. So I do think that what you're saying about medications helping people get out of the feedback loop is really valid, and I think would be a more balanced use of it than this kind of just be on it forever and not curious about how you can work with that. The Cancer Capricorn, the reason that I chose them is because depression is most associated, I think, with Capricorn and Saturn out of all of the signs. I could have gone to like Scorpio and Taurus to look at it in terms of transformation and creating consistency or these different axes, but for this, I just wanted to focus on like how to, like, I think the way that Brett was just saying it, of like creating a new house for the ego, changing the rules, and changing the ego structure as a way of changing the structures of depression. So those were the two archetypes, but there are, other ones would have worked. And as far as the list, I could have added, take, antidepressants for a little bit of time. I just have a more extreme view, I guess, because of my own bias.
What are some of them? You skipped over them. What are some of your favorites on that list?
Working with healers and energy workers, I think, can be really powerful because you can get outside energy boost from someone else with a different perspective. Removing ourselves from abusive situations if applicable, if there's some major dysfunction, like changing that. A gratitude practice is also really powerful. But I think some of these are also like habit oriented. Like breathwork, yoga, those things can be done every day.
Also, like the understanding that I took from like the whole presentation as an argument was that when you go to a Western psychiatrist, their immediate or Western medicine in general will turn first to drugs rather than to offering you the list of options that are not invasive in from a substance perspective. Like they don't talk to you about like, well, what does your diet look like? And like, are you, what does your body want to eat? And like, how do you feel? And like, what are ways that we can adjust your sleep pattern without medication? Like, and this list is also like really, it's great and it's really short. Like there's so many other things that can be introduced that don't require us to resort to medication. And my understanding from the presentation was that it was like reconditioning the rules of the whole system to condition ourselves to resort to something that's less invasive first, and then maybe go to medication if it's really necessary to interact with it. But like we aren't even taught in our society that breath work is something like that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I would add that the major thing I got from the presentation, which I would completely agree, is I don't know, maybe not necessarily, because I think our experience with like depending on which doctor, like it's slowly changing as well. But you're right, maybe on the whole. But like I really got from what you were saying is that like questioning the idea, which is really important, that mental illness is the same thing as like some other kind of illness, where you literally just have some imbalance, you fix the imbalance, the mental illness goes away. It's like, I think the idea that there's something much like deeper than that, whether it be like past, even past life trauma or just early life trauma or like whatever, but that it's something that it's fundamentally different than like other illnesses. And even other illnesses, you could argue, are like arising from some deeper cause. But basically just this idea that like you can diagnose someone as bipolar and that just means they are bipolar for the rest of their life. Like that's a really mistaken view of mental illness, and that I would argue is slowly changing even with like traditional doctors, thankfully.
Yeah.
Not fast enough, but yeah.
I would have asked for, like, I wanted a second opinion when I got the diagnosis, and my parents were like, no, you just want a different diagnosis. I was like, of course I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I found, like, I've noticed just watching, like, a lot of parents, just the way that groupthink is, like, as a culture, is that if it's safer to do what the group is deciding is the normal thing for that time, if all the kids are getting diagnosed with ADHD and on this medication, you're not going to be that parent that's out here doing the wacky, weird shaman thing. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to be like, no, we got him on the medication. Don't worry. And you want the school to know that. And so I think from like the parental standpoint, it's different when we're responsible for our own mental health. But when you're a child, your parents are responsible, and they have, like, you know, I think that is where the Capricorn Cancer polarity was really smart in that use, because the Capricorn archetype and even the Aquarius house, like those two houses are kind of where we seek the social approval or the social norm. And so if the cultural conditioning is to, like, oh, this is what we're doing right now, that follows us throughout our whole lives. And so much of what was happening when I was a teenager is totally different than what, like, my sister who's a teenager is subjected to. It can change within 5 or 6 years. And so I think that the cool thing about your talk is that you're kind of at the beginning of all of where we're heading towards. And you're like, your story is perfect for being like a voice to carry the torch into, like, the new age of mental health and stuff. You know what I mean? So I feel like you'll go far with this mission. And where we're going, because the science is coming out now, you know, that's like validating what you're saying in this presentation for sure. I'm into it.
First, I apologize for missing, like, most of your talk. So I feel kind of weird commenting, but just off of some of the things about our medicine system, I've been through absolute hell with all of this too. That's why I really wanted to be here. But I think, and this is going to go to a question that I had in regards to the fantasy element, I see the real dark side of our political culture, especially in the West, and it is severely dominated by the pharmaceutical company in a capitalist, just purely evil way. So whatever we want to believe, an alternative to that, whatever practices we want to have, whatever kind of positive transformation that we need, I know that it's personally difficult for me to even, like, find the willpower for it, because I feel so trapped in this other system that we have. And I know that transformation starts from the individual and then it goes outward. So we can't expect the world through whatever imagination that we want to change for us. We need to do it. So I guess, like, what I'm seeking, and I hope that we can offer as a community more, are ways to help guide people in that healing process that's kind of, you know, realistic to the world that we're living in, even if it's not necessarily a positive one. Because I feel like if we're not doing that, we're just kind of further helping to create that kind of division that we don't want to have between ourselves and others, and then that's not going to help. It's going to reflect and create more of a division internally, psychologically. So I was curious about fantasy, used the word fantasy a few times since I came in, and regards to kind of being able to imagine a better world for ourselves in a healing way. But I worry, like, you know, kind of the negative effects that can have on us psychologically or somatically and in our lives, of, like, falling into delusion. Mm-hmm. And yeah. I'm curious if you talked about, I don't know if this is like a Mercury trickster type of thing, but that pops up for me a lot archetypally, and if Mercury came up, or if you would relate that, if maybe where that is in a person's chart or in their lives, if that kind of depicts how the imagination acts in regards to fantasizing.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. So it kind of gave me an image of the repetitive fantasy as a way of changing one's vibrational field. The way that I kind of played with it is that, like, when I was in this space, I was, like, recently traumatized, didn't feel like I was being taken seriously by people. And so I would like imagine myself as like a professional or an authority or something and start to do things to build that or something. And so it was a combination of fantasy and concrete acts that validated the fantasy. So like kind of like method acting through life based on the fantasy. And I'm someone who engages in fantasy so much that like it does, the shadow is of course delusion. And so like having this like these time periods in life where you know, I've had extreme fantasies that I've wanted to manifest and I'm pushing and like a few years goes by and I'm like, wow, like this isn't going to happen and I have to let it go. And like those, like that's just the difficult part of it. But there is some kind of alchemical effect in pushing a fantasy for so long that other people start, you know, like for me, like starting a business and just having people be like, you can't be an astrologer. That's not like a real job. Like you're insane, you know, just like pushing a different reality and then other people starting to respond to it. I started to notice that a lot of people are responding to social conditioning. And if you are a trickster or you present something else, that they will, they may kind of resist it or like not be into it. But another part of them often will be really curious by it and they'll think about it. And if in that moment when someone's critiquing you being different or kind of being a trickster and you capitulate to that and you're like, oh, you're right, like never mind, and you go back and hide, then it validates their limited thinking. But if you hold it down of like, this is who I am, this is my fantasy that I'm making real, and they're like, oh, you know, they kind of have to face that, it can start to kind of, that inner shift that you were talking about permeate into the collective. I think, yeah.
Do you think that this is dependent on, so repetition I put together with rhythm, and that's evolution, right? Adaptation in different ways, and I feel like we need repetition to have any kind of order psychologically or socially. But it gets maddening. Like you can don't get into all of like OCD and just so completely neurotic, just being repetitive all the time too. And it can reinforce the good or it can reinforce the bad. Do you feel that the repetition in your life has like more so benefited, like in mantra? It's really just like what we're repeating, right?
Yeah, it's the discerning of what you're repeating, and even like being on a self-improvement path and then realizing like, oh, self-improvement is correlated to not feeling good enough, and I have to stop not feeling good enough in order to actually improve. So like figuring out what you want to repeat. And the way that I like to do that is I don't judge myself for the thoughts that go through my mind. I'm not responsible for them, but the things I say out loud or the things I write with my will are like completely my choice. And that helps me a lot with anxiety because I have no agency about what goes through my mind, you know?
Yeah. It's somewhat similar to what you asked. Right? She was asking earlier about spirit and in relation to delusion and like listening to the world. And so my question is, the perspective that you share with people diverges from what we're taught in many ways, that what's true is measurable and in a very concrete way, that it's reproducible. And so my question for you is like day to day or just like moment to moment, and sometimes it, you know, it may be the case that you don't know until much later, like you were describing letting go of something. But what, like, how do you, actually, I think I might know how you might answer this in some sense, but more like broadly speaking, like what's your measure for truth, or like what's real?
There's one of my astrology teachers he made a video and he was talking about how Uranus and Aquarius are associated with truth, and it's also mental structures that we project onto truth. And that you can have a thought and you can also have a real thought. And the way that I measure things that are real for me has been somatic senses of electricity that I feel in my body and visuals that I get. But those have not always, sometimes it's like, okay, there's resonance here, but I can even misinterpret them. And so I think that like going with the tide of the highest excitement, that's something that they teach with law of attraction and stuff, is follow your highest excitement and do that all the time, and it will condition your reality into a more exciting, so that charge, like you have two different ideas and one has charge and one feels kind of lackluster, but it's like normal and what people have already done. Then if you follow the electric one, that it will open up life in some way. And I just think that it comes with a learning curve when playing with these things, because at least the tried and true, or like the Saturnian, societal kind of Saturnian, is like the path's already there. But yeah, I think there's a deep kind of knowing, but even that knowing can be conditioned, because there's another thing that a spiritual teacher said once that I laugh at when I think about, but he was saying, someone in the audience was kind of asking something around that effect of like, how do you know what this universe is about? How do you know what God knows? And he said back, like, you are God, you are the creation. So just think about it until you get the right answer. So yeah, feeling into what feels alive and electric, and then knowing that you may be wrong and you can try again. But that faith, or that radical, like, oh, I'm going to trust this aliveness that I feel, I think opens up the path for more and more resonance.
Yeah, I appreciate the humility and also the tenacity that you expressed.
It confirms what you said earlier, that if you're praying to God, God's praying to you by default.
Yeah.
And your response just a little bit ago is really a beautiful image of Saturn and Neptune cooperating. It's like, instead of being mercurial, like, oh, I'm an astrologer, people say, no, it's impossible. You say, oh, I'm in a like, I'm just going to go over here. That you create the vision and then bring it into matter, stick to it. And that is your reality. I mean, you can go overboard and say, oh, I live in a reality where we fly. And if you're not flying at all, it's kind of hard to say. But if you're an astrologer and you're developing an astrological practice, so it takes some Saturn boundaries, right? And some awareness of those boundaries and of what you can actually believe in and support to fully get behind what you're willing to manifest. I think it's actually a beautiful way of seeing Neptune and Saturn work together. You're in that Capricorn stellium realm, yeah?
I have Uranus and Neptune conjunct Saturn and Aquarius.
What a cool day for this talk, with Moon occulting Saturn.
That's why I chose it. I like Thanks, everyone. If there's any more questions, feel free to just ask me, write to me, or anything. I love all your thoughts.
Bye, everybody.